the idea of bringing to life things quickly, there's some traits that I've seen and observed, and we certainly follow here at Stoke. One of them is certainly the idea of distributed ownership. If there's any impression that engineering is still this sort of cascaded chief engineer to staff to technician and on down, that's not the way it works anymore. There's ownership, and so for every element that we show, and this is true at most significant hardware programs, you have responsible engineers and people who own aspects of the product who need to come together because their dependencies are just driving them forward. So that's one of many traits, but distributed ownership certainly is where it starts, and that's one of the kind of core leadership principles to get people a sense of just shared commitment and make sure that's really happening.
Hello and welcome to the Leadership Launchpad, where we help technical managers improve themselves, their teams, and their organizations. On this show, I talk with industry leaders, coaches, authors, and experts to give you actionable insights to help improve your own performance and the performance of those around you. Our guest today is Chris Kaufield. Chris builds operating solutions for teams that thrive on speed to market. At rocket company Stokespace, he leads the growth of its commercial software Fusion, which is equipping aerospace, climate, and defense businesses with methods for breakthrough hardware development. Chris specializes in organizational culture shifts, previously owning sales and marketing of new teams' platforms at Microsoft, as well as manufacturing, industrial, and logistics experts. I can't tell you how excited I was for this conversation. I will admit the beginning of this episode geeks a little bit out on space. And so if you're not as much of a nerd about that stuff as I am, I highly recommend that you stick around because we get into a lot of leadership and culture topics. In this episode, expect to learn what it means to have a high cadence organization, the tension and trade-offs of building an organization that is focused on product first, and how distributed ownership and operational accountability can build better leaders. Before we get into the discussion, I do want to ask you very quickly that if you are not subscribed, please make sure you subscribe to the show so that you never miss a future episode. And if you are already subscribed, then I would ask you to share this show with at least one other person, because after all, that is how we grow. I can't tell you how much it means to me. So with that, let's get into the discussion with Chris Kaufield. Chris, welcome to the Leadership Launchpad. How are you doing today?
I'm great. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I can't tell you how excited I am for this conversation, because me as a space nerd, I've been following Stokespace pretty closely. I think probably ever since the Everyday Astronaut tour several months ago. That was pretty big. I think a lot of people saw that, but a lot of my listeners aren't up to speed necessarily on the space industry. So I would love to hear from you. What's at a high level the ambitious goals of Stokespace?
Yeah, we're a rocket company in Washington State, about 150 people. And what we're building is a new kind of rocket to carry commercial and government payloads. The new kind of rocket is pretty exciting because it's meant to drive daily flights. We think that the space industry is moving in this direction, and it's sort of the inevitable outcome of all the work people are doing on reusability and bringing things back to Earth and not tossing them in the ocean, but flying them again. In our case, the breakthrough is reusing the stage two, which really hasn't been demonstrated before. We recently showed the first flight of a demonstrator vehicle not that long ago and how that's going to work. But ultimately, we think that by flying daily and a rapid turnaround clip with a rocket that's meant to go up and come back down in all of its pieces, you end up with just this fast pace and low cost, something like an airline model. So that's really the mission and the focus on Stokespace's from Stokespace's leadership team, which put together the company about 4 years ago. These are folks that are, Andy and Tom, ex-Blue Origin, brought in experts from all over, including your former employer, who's got just a ton of talent to share with the world. And since then, we've grown to build everything in-house as much as we can, and really develop the system so that it can be really a breakthrough in how the industry receives services from space providers. Along the way, we've built this rocket, but there's sort of this this relationship between building breakthrough things and having to build the systems and methodologies and cultures to build the thing. And so that's a pretty exciting part of my role, which is to help take the methodology that we use to develop this rocket system and bring it to others.
Yeah, that I think is one of the unique things about the company. I mean, not only, I mean, geez, 150 people, you all are doing a lot. You just the pace at which you all are operating is really, really impressive. And you yourself are the VP of SaaS growth, the VP of software growth. And that's different. So you say you're a rocket company, but you're a rocket company that's selling a SaaS product.
Yeah, that's right.
How did that happen?
Yeah, I think for most companies that build new hardware, there's a understanding that the tough bit isn't so much the design. I mean, if you and I decided that we're going to build a new rocket, we could at least design it on a napkin today. We'd probably get that
Yeah.
far and say, this is the
Yeah.
shape and this is the general requirements. And then in the world of making things, there's a lot of production capacity out there. Companies that do nothing but do fabs and contract manufacturing or in-house at an automaker. But the problem with most breakthrough hardware, and I'm talking about anything from aerospace products to submersibles to climate tech to energy plants, is this development period.
Yeah.
And the development period is really when the abstract design meets the physical world, where you're getting into actual hands-on parts and components that might break, they might succeed, but you need to know why either way, and you need to be able
Yeah.
to move those forward into the next milestone. And so this whole space of development is really, in a sense, it's kind of the business model of Stoke. If we can't bring together this concept of a fleet of vehicles that can fly
Yeah.
quickly, if we can't bring that to life quickly, we as a company are going to have some stress about how much that cost, and are our customers just waiting indefinitely. Well, no, we really
Yeah.
want to bring this to life as soon as possible because the industry needs it. And so this development process, what we've realized is that there is a way to approach development using some new methods, or at least refined methods, that we're calling high cadence engineering. And that idea and the principles behind it of how you bring to life something that's complex and new and maybe even just unprecedented, that's something that we thought we could bottle up. In fact, we kind of had to, because as we grow, our team needs to follow some of these principles and practices. So rather than the what is really quite typical in the world of new hardware, building on spreadsheets and sort of organizational tools and project management tools and note taking apps, which really happens in the world. We wanted to codify a lot of the sort of behaviors and methods into something that we call Fusion, and that's now become a successful commercial offering. It's available to companies that are building their own breakthrough hardware, but it really became, I think, this flywheel between hardware and software
Yeah.
that once we unlock that, we can make sure that that pace that we want is kept as quick as possible. Fortunately, I'm really just thrilled to say that the company has hit these major milestones, including first engine fires and first flights, using these methodologies, and it's a really interesting relationship between hardware, software, people, and methods. But that's what it takes to really build, the exciting stuff that we all are just following online and in social.
Yeah, exactly. And it's really interesting because, I mean, it's great proof that the pudding is good, really, in that,
Yeah,
if you're having if you're having this tremendous success and you're doing it with this software and this approach, then when you approach others, it's probably pretty easy, like, oh, okay, like, let's do this. And I love how you spoke to that point of kind of needing to build the ecosystem. I remember when I was at SpaceX, and always in the back of my mind, I always kind of had this fear of thinking, like, Starship is going to get built and then there's going to be nothing to put in it because
yeah,
nobody like believes that something like that is gonna exist. Um, kind of briefly mentioned earlier that you're almost like, it's not so much a software, it's a culture. It's a way of
yeah.
doing things. This, what high cadence engineering is, it's a way to operate. It's a culture for a company to have. What I would love to know, some of the elements of that culture, and like what's different about this high pace of operations.
Yeah, when we think of high cadence engineering, you think of a sort of a tension between hitting your commercial milestones, or those milestones that are going to drive your company forward as fast as possible, while simultaneously setting yourself up to reduce the burden for the next set of milestones. So that
Mm,
tension is kind of interesting. For example, on our world, we knew that we had to get reusability out of a rocket in order to really serve our customers the way we wanted to. We knew that's where the business model was, is full reusability.
Yeah.
But it sure is much easier to hit a milestone that says just launch something, because you can
Sure.
launch an expendable rocket or another design much more quickly than you could to put together a reusable design in the first place.
Yeah.
However, if you do that, you actually did not minimize the burden for the next set of milestones. You made yourself more
Yeah.
difficult, because now you have to
Yeah.
unwind the first go at it and
Yeah.
start over to pick up where you really want to be. And so you kind of can end up in some deception and sort of feints and frustrations if you don't sort of build those things together. This sort of path to milestones that'll move your company forward.
Hmm.
And when I say that, I mean you're building your product, but you're also building your company as you go, because the product is effectively new. So
Yeah.
that's kind of the essential tension. There's a few key things that really seem to recur again and again when you think this way. And I think you can tell me, in your own experience, and maybe others have a point of view about this, but it doesn't necessarily apply to just hardware. The idea of bringing to life things quickly.
Yeah.
There's some traits that I've seen and observed, and we certainly follow here at Stoke. One of them is certainly the idea of distributed ownership. If there's any impression that engineering is still a sort of cascaded chief engineer to staff to technician and on down, that's not the way it works anymore.
No.
There's ownership, and so for every element that we show, and this is true at most significant hardware programs, you have responsible engineers and people who own aspects of the product who need to come together because their dependencies are just driving them forward. So that's one of many traits, but distributed ownership certainly is where it starts, and that's one of the kind of core leadership principles to get people a sense of just shared commitment and make sure that's really happening.
Yeah, I think you're 100% right in that this isn't a thing that's unique to the hardware world, but it really comes to light in the hardware world because there can be so much more investment than in other
Yeah,
things in each
yeah,
step forward. So if it's software or if it's building a consulting business or just building an idea, sometimes it can be easy. It's a lot easier for you to run down a road and then change the road. Whereas in your
yeah,
world, in any hardware world, you're investing a lot in the infrastructure, in the tools to make the thing, and sometimes the
yeah.
tools to make the tools to make the thing.
Yeah,
And
that's
so,
right. There's a
yeah,
there's a paradox. You're going to invent something new. Well, congratulations, you're going to invent the tools to build the new thing, and
yes,
and
yeah,
so everybody assumes that. But what if you could do something a little differently? And that's been our experience, is that you can start to embed these practices into software and into behaviors as well.
yeah,
You actually brought up an interesting point, because the iterations you make as you make that progress, one of the other elements of high cadence engineering, or let's just call it high cadence output, is the idea of continuous traceability. You really need
mm,
to know what each step produced in order for the next step to depend on it or be successful or to change course. Here again, if you tested a new engine design, or even a new accounting system, or maybe a partner relationship model, if you don't know if it worked or not, or even worse, even if it did work or not, the reasons behind it, you're sort of doomed to repeat the problem one way or another.
yeah,
Hardware is just kind of more tangible in that way, where if I have a bolt that broke, wow, that physical thing broke. Let's find out what happened. Whereas if
yeah,
it's in more of a squishy, corporate culture, maybe you just don't know how to even diagnose that problem. But tracing what you've done is one of the things that software can help with.
yeah,
It's great at it. It's great at recording things. Now you got to figure out how to record the right things and not the wrong things, I suppose. But you really need to know what happened in order to be able to move forward. And there's industries like government, customer industries especially, where if you don't prove along the way what happened and how you did the
yes,
thing, you
yes.
may not even have a business after all.
Yeah, no, absolutely. You've mentioned a couple terms here that I want to make sure to pause and kind of parse out, bring us into this leadership realm that kind of we talk about in this idea of organizational culture. The first thing you mentioned was distributed ownership. That for me, I will admit, I think when I left the military and went into more of the space kind of tech world, that was one of the things that I struggled the most with making a transition in, because I was used to a world where there was always a owner. If I want to make a
Yeah.
change, I go out and find which leader is responsible for that part of the organization. I convince them, and then I'm done. Like then the decision just kind of cascades down. And a lot of companies now just no matter if they have a higher, whatever the hierarchy looks like, it in practice is much different because a lot of that ownership is at much lower levels, and getting the okay from the boss really is just an okay to go convince everybody of your idea, and that's kind
Yeah.
of it. What does distributed ownership look like at Stoke? How does that manifest itself?
Yeah, I mean, it's fortunately it's a very straightforward understanding. Even if you're not from the world of rocket engineering or hardware in general, if you see something on a rocket that looks like a physical thing, there's probably a person that owns that physical thing.
Yeah.
And of course, that sort of makes sense. If you own the propulsion system, or you own a structure, or you own a navigation or avionics computer, it sort of is very tangible and tactile. So that's one thing that really I think hardware gets an advantage over, let's more abstract ideas of kind of
Yeah.
kind of classic corporate management maybe. And I've lived in that world as well. I had 13 years at Microsoft, for example, and so we're dealing with software and go to market motions, and all the things that make commercial success there are just a little different compared to a rocket that either flies or it doesn't. So it's very
Yeah.
binary. So as a
Yeah.
result, I think products like rockets tend to draw people into very specific areas, because without those owners, the void would be obvious to all. If we didn't have
Mm,
a thruster engineer that's owning the thrusters, everybody who's waiting for that that connection to essentially hook up to the rest of the structure and bring the whole machine to life, the dependency is ultra clear. So
yeah.
that kind of ownership, if you can find ways of creating ownership that blanket the end product, whatever that is, the product or service, you have a good chance, especially if you build dependencies among people, of people right sizing and finding the right trade-offs to make that system work. But I think you alluded to this, a lot of, even in classic aerospace cultures, there is a lot of departmental and budgetary behavior which drives ownership rather than product ownership.
Yeah.
And that can really bring down an agile, nimble program like a new rocket like we're building, because you don't know how to size departments when you're building a product like this. You don't know what the right
Yeah.
budget should be now versus the future. You don't know whether the corporate design you built is even going to support the product when it goes. And so we take much more of a product oriented focus on building our output and shape the organization to the product, versus attempting, which is so classic, of creating this reusable enterprise and then hope that products can just flow across the top of it.
Yeah. Yeah, the last time we talked, you said it so succinctly. You said, build an organization based on the product instead of building the product based on the organization. And it actually reminded me of something that Jason Fried from 37 Signals once said, where he talks about how and this is a few years ago before kind of funding crashed in startups, but he was saying how one of the reasons why so many startups, even software startups, needed to go get millions of dollars of capital to start is because they were all trying to start as if they were Facebook or Apple.
Yeah,
And so like
that's right.
table stakes was a 50 team, software engineer, a 50 person software engineering
Yeah.
team, and all this almost bloat, because to your point, you don't know what you're going to do. um, how do you make those decisions? Because, and this goes back to that tension that you were mentioning at the beginning of, there is a little bit of, you don't want to you need to build a product, but then you need to build the organization to support it, and there's kind of that back and forth. How do you make those decisions in terms of when to grow the organization or not?
I think a lot of the growth that we encourage is a result of kind of natural conditions pushing you to the next milestone because you've created a certain level of accountability. And what I mean by that is, we are heavily vertically integrated for one. And so
Yeah.
building in house and relying on the work that responsible engineers or owners make, and seeing it all the way through, is a really quick way of sussing out where you've got weaknesses and lack capacity. So
Hmm.
that's one way to bring forward the areas of investment that you need to make. I mean, so for example, in our world, if we can put an engine on a test stand in hours or days instead of weeks or months, meaning we're close to our test site. We can additively
Yep.
manufacture components that we need, meaning that we've got a supply of infrastructure right on site, meaning that our components are modular enough where they can be transported. All of that, all the logistics that make that happen. If we can do that, then we're self-sufficient in a way that is ahead of the pace of the industry and ahead of our own milestones.
Right.
Whereas if we had allowed ourselves to sort of stretch out these responsibilities and sort of softly tail off into supply chains and consultants and partners, you really don't know whether or not you've got what you need to get the job done, and you really also delay the time in which you see the output or the value coming back from your investment. So having that focus on that in-house capability where you can do end-to-end projects shows you then where you're going to reach the limits of those end-to-end projects and shows you where people need to invest further. So, for us, if we build all
Yeah.
the propulsion elements that go on a rocket and we say, you know what, we need to turn that up times five, we know exactly the math to turn that
Yeah.
up times five versus this
Yeah.
loose sense of suppliers and ownership that's out there. So that kind of self-sufficiency is really important. I'd introduce one more accountability that really helps, I think, with this in terms of do you have the right people running the right thing and are you getting back what you thought you would? And that's what I'll call operational accountability, meaning
Mm.
do you have to run the stuff that you build? In our case, our business model
Yeah.
depends on it. We're going to have a fleet of vehicles that are, if we're on course for daily flights and we're turning things around as rapidly as possible, the ability to do that goes all the way back to the original engineering team that started out, building for that problem, and
Yep.
then you now live with it and you understand where you need to refine it. Um, this is something that also helps with the guidance that grows a company successfully if you have to live with your stuff. If you don't and you hand off your product to someone else, the signals are going to be fuzzy, varied, and if nothing else, just lengthy before you really understand what's going on and how to be successful. So we want to shorten all of that so you get a much more precise signal, and that signal will drive your organizational behavior.
It's really interesting how things that can seem so different are so similar. You mentioned how when you build a part on the rocket, like it's a physical thing that you can see,
Yeah.
and if it works, it works. If it doesn't, it doesn't. And how that can be more difficult in fuzzier, maybe soft skills, leadership, culture kind of things. But wow, everything you were just saying, I think you could just change a few words and it would have the exact same meaning in the world that I'm more traditionally accustomed to. You say, we want to launch some DEI initiatives. And so you build a whole team in order to do that without taking the time. If you're saying you want some DEI initiatives, there should be some clear outcome that you're trying to achieve or some clear wrong that you're trying to address in your company so that you can have that clear, go no go idea of did this work or did this not. But once you hire a bunch of people, build a big team, well, now you got to use those people, and so you're going to start doing stuff whether you need to or not. Really similar. And then similarly, let's say you don't build a big team, you outsource your leadership development, and so now there's some new problem that you're trying to solve inside your organization. Well, rather than going to an instructional designer and tweaking some slides or tweaking a presentation in a couple of days, and next week you're delivering some new material, you now have to go to the consultant, sign a new contract, figure out a whole new way you're going to work together, and now it's 6 months before you can roll it out. So in the end, it all comes back to, when we talk about like hard skills and soft skills, I always say the only difference between hard skills and soft skills is that we haven't thought about the soft skills hard enough to make them hard, right?
Yeah.
But it all comes down to these same kind of clear deliverables or clear outcomes that we should all be trying to define.
I think that's right. And I have a benefit of having worked in sort of the software world and certainly the software world and then in the hardware world and back again. And, there is it's nothing more illuminating to cross the ponds where, you may have come from the world of software or consulting or something else. You go work on hardware for a while. And similarly, going from hardware to these more IP driven or at least, sort of cloud driven ideas these days. It's just hugely humbling, but it also lets you know that, yeah, there are some best practices you can borrow here and there. I happen to recommend hardware businesses these days. One, I think it's just the vanguard of a lot of things that the US needs, but also the world needs. A lot of solutions that are coming, whether they're, reducing carbon at sea, or they're
Yeah.
solving for more efficient supply chains, or medical care. There's all sorts of things that are going to be hardware dependent, and so we're seeing a lot of those things come to life. But again, that kind of hardware product tends to bring together, it tends to remove fuzziness about the state of the problem and the state of the development. Now, really opaque products can get into trouble, kind of notoriously, AI gadgets and all sorts of stuff that's meant to be top secret and then show up with a customer. That probably didn't sort of, follow a few of the things we just talked about. Like, for example,
Yeah.
do you have to run those yourself? Would you have to
Yeah.
sit with a, caregiver to see how that actually works in the real world? If you just sort of foist it on your customers, that's not the spirit of this at all either. The goal is to go quickly, but have attention so that you can keep going quickly and deliver the right thing.
Yeah. A couple more terms that have come up. You dove into continuous traceability. You know, you were traceability is something that I had never heard of until I got into the hardware world. Many people probably never heard about it, and then you realize as soon as you get there, as you were saying, it is one of the more important words
No.
in hardware, especially if you're dealing with government contracts. Out, how have you seen that? Can you see that in a non-hardware way as well? Like when it comes to leadership, what does it mean to be trying to have that same kind of traceability, or do you make an attempt to have that same kind of traceability of things like decisions in the organization?
Yeah, I think the term it actually is everywhere. It's one of those terms where when you look for it, you'll just sort of see it everywhere. For
Yeah.
example,
Yeah.
the food supply,
Yeah.
traceability of North Sea salmon. Where did that come from versus, and how was it caught?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And to just for anybody who hasn't heard the term before, just to spread it out a little bit, it's again in this world, you're selling a rocket to the U.S. government. They put a big expensive satellite on it. It goes up. Something goes wrong with the launch. You kind of trace back to there was a problem with this bolt. Okay, what lot number was that bolt? Where was it stored? Was it stored properly for its entire life? Where did it come from? What plant was it manufactured in? That's kind of what traceability tends to mean in this hardware world.
Yeah, that's right. And it does cross over into the human activity, because it's not just the bolt, it was the procedure used to install the bolt. Well, that's a very
Yeah.
human thing. That's an
Yeah.
instructional thing. That's a process thing that, does apply in any other industry. And the same is true with safe handling of food, or medicines. Traceability is required for lots of aspirin. And these are the types of things that, for those folks that run critical supply chains like this, almost every conversation is about how to get a better understanding and inspection of where things are going or where they're not, or could be fair trade apparel. I mean, there's all sorts of physical products now that have to embed a history and a story of their provenance, to be successful. But I think it really is, for high performance cultures where, you're making some of these breakthrough moves, one way or another. I think companies find a way to, if they don't call it traceability, they embed it into the culture. I mean, famously at Amazon,
Mm.
the notorious 6-page memo that everybody needs to
Yeah.
read before they embark on a particular track of a new project. Um, Dedicate time to reading the memo. You go to the meeting and say, "Don't worry about being prepared. We're all going to sit down and study the
Yep.
original view of what we're about to take on, the pros and the cons, but also the expected outcome." That original memo is a traceability history for the moves you're going to make. And so when
Absolutely.
Amazon goes into music, or they go into some new distributed product, you can see all the way back to the path of the decision making and how that led to different investments and the course corrections and so on.
Yeah.
So I think, yeah, traceability certainly has a role in human decisions and behavior. I think it just, hardware is one of those great sort of disciplines that forces you to look at it and say, it's not a nice to have, it's a must to have.
Yeah. Well, as you said, you've been at a lot of organizations. You've been on the hardware side, you've been at the software side, you've been in a lot of very successful organizations. When you think about this like high cadence engineering or a high cadence organization, for leaders, whether they're all organizations like this or they're just trying to create a team like this, what are some other ways other than what we've talked about, kind of the role of a leader change in a high cadence organization?
Well, certainly you're not looking for. I think it puts a new stress on leaders as practitioners, or to have
Mm.
some ability to contribute the actual effect of the team. So in other words, um, for a long time, we thought we could abstract away the idea of leadership and simply have managers in place. And
Hmm.
that's been seeing some upheaval. The folks that run and own elements of a rocket program at Stoke are the folks that understand what the team is building. And so they may not
Hmm.
be in the org placed at the most senior level, but they run that functional team in
Mm.
a sort of a matrix style, I suppose. But
Yeah.
certainly, a ownership of the product means that you're a leader in practice, if not in the org chart. So that's something to look out for. Of just put people in harm's way, put people where they have to do the job that they're responsible for,
Mm.
allow the team to right size itself appropriately so that that leader gets the support they need, but give them some tools and hands off and let them run. And the best way to do that is not to sort of hope for the best, but create dependencies among other leaders so that the whole system is adjusting and checking on where there might be gaps or limits or maybe even skills that need to be brought in. Because otherwise, it's a little bit, it feels a little disempowering to sort of, especially at an executive level, say, okay, leaders, let's just run amok. What we're really trying to do is create a system of dependencies so that leaders are boosting each other.
Yeah. Yeah. And yeah, I 100% agree with that, of this idea of like, you need to, it goes back to the idea that you used of operational accountability, of you need to give people some tools and let them run with it. The one thing I would ask you though, with this like kind of matrix style organization with this distributed ownership is, do you have any particular ways to make critical decisions or even just general decisions or deal with conflict, because there's so many different owners and you're kind of relying on this give and take between them to find the right solution? How do you make sure that those are amicable discussions, that they're based on fact and not personality?
Yeah.
what are the techniques that you use?
Yeah, engineering specifically, but again, I think we can generalize here. It's
Hmm.
all about trades, and
Yeah.
you get a bit of a benefit in hardware that the trades are based on physics and real world conditions
Yeah.
that people have
Yeah.
not conjured up.
Yeah.
And so, what you're really doing is you're resolving conflicts around the expected performance of the product you're making, not conflicts among people, is what happens. Because if
Yes.
I say, boy, I found a great way to build a very reliable, battery system for the avionics, it's just going to cost us, 20 kilograms of payload. People are saying, hey, we can't have that trade because that payload is already under stress from something else we're trying to have. So you can have 5 kilograms. That, very sort of contrived example, but it happens nonstop. And when you have a product that's front and center asking for people to optimize it, that's what happens, and that's where conflict gets resolved. Versus the classic, well, it's time for annual budgets, raise your hand and advocate for your team and hope you get the extra headcount, or hope
Hmm.
you have the least amount of pain when it comes to reducing the team. All of that sort of thing is trying to optimize an organization, not optimize a product. So
Yeah.
I think wherever possible, find those things that have the immutable laws around them and have people attack that optimization schedule rather than the things that we all like to contrive and the things that don't really matter in the end.
Yeah.
And if you're not building a hardware product, get customer centric. That's the way to do this, is
Yeah.
to get
Yeah.
in front of a customer who has to optimize with their rules, which to you are immutable, but
Yeah.
you can work on those and you can chip away at those. And so if you have a consulting client or you have a software product you're shipping, that customer wants to have a trade-off between, sort of cost and performance. They want to have a trade-off between ease of use and sophistication. They want all those
Yep.
things. Well,
Yep.
that's pretty good. And that's a lot better than taking the guesswork internally and just sort of, propping up your departments.
Yeah, absolutely. And I also just really love that idea of trades. I heard recently, uh, I forget where exactly I heard this, but it was said, they said, there's no solutions, there's only trade-offs.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it's such a great way to enter into a mindset, to enter into any disagreement or any conversation with, because it becomes not about deciding who's right or wrong. We're saying
Yeah.
there is not a right and wrong. Many of these things could be right or wrong depending on what we care about most. And so it's just about these trade-offs of finding how we're going to find a balance between the two decisions.
Yeah. Yeah. And of course, to complete the loop, you need to instrument the trades to understand, did we get what we thought we would
Yep.
out of that trade? Did you
Yeah.
get the thrust out of the rocket engine, or did you get the uptick in sales, or did you get the increased sort of safety headroom of a given problem? And so you need to instrument it constantly. And so data is absolutely the lifeblood.
Yeah.
But it's no substitute for people having a concept of what are good trades. We'll see if
Yeah.
AI can help with this, but so far, in this type of world where you're really breaking new ground and you're coming up with new products, it's a lot of judgment backed by evidence and a sort of a virtuous cycle to make sure that those two things stay together as fast as possible.
Yeah. Awesome. I love talking. I think one of the most interesting things about the rocket world is that getting to space is just such a hard problem that it
Yeah.
pushes you're always on the edge cases. You're always, just pushing the boundaries. And I think it's a really great way to think about all aspects of human challenges, uh, and taking that same kind of mindset. So really excited to kind of talk through this with you. So Stokespace, like you said, you had your first flight of kind of that the test second stage of the vehicle. You got the initial hot fire of your first stage engine, which is just tremendous. I know you don't talk, as you said, you tend to like do more than talk at
Yeah.
Stoke. What are like the next big milestones? I mean, I feel like if you're just doing, I imagine it's going to be quite a long campaign of hot firing before we start talking about like first stage stuff, like whole first stage stuff.
Yeah, I'm, as we talk, I'm sitting in about 175,000 square feet of manufacturing space in my side room here, and it's humming. I mean, we're building all the components that you would expect to visualize on our rocket, which we call Nova. Nova two-stage rocket. If you want just sort of a sense of what it can carry, think small car kind of payload and maybe a
Yeah.
bit beyond. So sort of medium lift category is the way we look at it. But all the elements are now been either fabricated in full scale or close to it, and are
Wow.
now available for our, sort of, let's call it light integration test of how things will come together. So that's really for us a major milestone in that we can say we're now on the later stages of development cycles, sort of all up. And as we move forward, it's going to be more and more, systems becoming larger blocks for testing rather than for smaller discrete elements. And then ultimately, what that sort of turns into is the first full scale launch and orbital flight, which is sort of in a calendar year plus sort of horizon. So not far off, but not immediate, but certainly on a rocket schedule. That will be the fastest ever of a company moving from
Absolutely.
seed money to first flight. In fact, all of our milestones, first engine fires and hops, have all been ahead of any industry pace like this. So that's something that's really hard earned, but it's also just a lot of great people figuring out how to
Yeah.
pull together a program and borrow all the things they learned elsewhere and bring them to a nice point here, coupled with some fantastic leadership of Andy and Tom who've been through this before in different places and saw things they liked and didn't. And now we're just keeping up that pace so we can hit that goal of daily flights and full reuse.
Awesome. Well, I'm a huge fan. I'm excited. I'm certain Stoke got a few more fans listening to this, people who'd never heard of it before. So I can't wait to see the future success of the company. Thank you again so much for coming on today, Chris. And I look forward to chatting with you in the future.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you so much for listening to today's show. If you are looking for help turning your organization's great engineers into great managers, me and my team at Better Everyday Studios would love to help. We deliver targeted and interactive training workshops that are designed to help build the 3 fundamental skills of any new manager: building trust, giving feedback, and setting goals. Reach out to me through matt@bettereverydaystudios.com so we can start making your organization better every day.